Peter, I have been obsessed virtually my whole life with trying to discern what ultimate reality is. And today, generally there's perceived two approaches. One is a scientific view, another is a theological view, and people talk about that all the time. But metaphysics, which perhaps in popular thought is something for a cult or the Middle Ages or something, really tells us something very substantial about how to understand reality. So I come to you to understand metaphysics.
Well, I don't know, Robert, if I have any understanding to offer you. I'll try to talk about how I understand things. Metaphysics is a very hard term to define. It's been defined in various ways and various points in the history of philosophy, but I don't mind if you simply define it using two words that you just used as the study that attempts to get at the nature of ultimate reality. I think there must be this ultimate reality for us to get at. I mean, if somebody says there isn't any ultimate reality, isn't that a statement about how things really are?
Sure.
Basis? So there must be some way that things really are. There are appearances, of course, that can be deceptive. People long thought that the Earth was completely stationary because that's the way it seemed to be. But in reality, the Earth was moving. What lies behind all appearances must be this ultimate reality. If somebody says there's no ultimate reality beyond all appearances, again, we have this same dilemma, because that seems to be a description of the way ultimate reality is. To say there is no ultimate reality is to describe ultimate reality. Well, I would say that the questions that we might ask about ultimate reality could be divided into three groups. We might want to ask, for example, what are the most general features of the world? I mean, if we just use the phrase the world to mean the collection of all the things that there are and the ways they're related to each other, what are the most general features of this? And
What are some examples of that?
The most general features of the world, for example, is everything material? Or, as some philosophers have suggested, is there nothing material? Is the existence of human beings, for example, an accident or not? But maybe that might be said, part might be said to belong to another aspect, to another one of the three questions that I might ask. But having raised this question about about the most general features of the world, about whether it contains both the mental and physical, whether time and space are real aspects of the world, whether causality is a real aspect of the world, we can go on and ask why there is a world at all. Why isn't there something rather than nothing? And that's certainly a question that metaphysics addresses.
That's the second question.
That's the second question. And finally, the third question, we can ask how we human beings fit into the world. What's our place in it? Are we, for example, just accidents, just things that happen to come to exist that don't have any more meaning than the shape of the stain on the floor when you spill some wine at dinner? Or do we really have a point or purpose in the world? Anybody who offers reasoned answers to these questions, who attempts to think these questions through, is going to be a metaphysician. This person will, of course, if he or she has any sense, help himself to what science can tell us. We need to know everything science has to tell us about the world, but even if we take everything that science can tell us, it seems to many of us that still these questions haven't been answered. If somebody insists that science can tell us everything about the world, one wonders how the person knows that. Does science tell us that science tells us everything about the world? Or do we have to step outside science and think about science to see whether it can tell us everything that there is to know about the relation between science and the world? And since the relation between science and the world is part of the world, if you really have to step outside science to think about that, then science can't tell you By your very act of doing that, stepping outside, you're admitting that science can't tell you everything. Some people think that there are revelations from supernatural beings that would provide answers to some of these questions. Where the world came from, what's the place of human beings in the world. But even then, impartial reason has to look at these supposed revelations and decide whether they really are to be accepted as revelation. So you can't simply rely on revelation because there are conflicting revelations, and you have to step outside revelation and decide between them. So this stepping outside science, this stepping outside revelation to consider these questions about ultimate reality, that's what I'd mean by metaphysics.
Okay, so metaphysics is a way of thinking. It involves techniques, because you've said that there's no philosophical information like you can get from a geology book or a music book. That philosophy is different.
Sadly, this is so. At one time it seemed not. Plato could suppose that he was telling the truth about things. Then Aristotle could say, well, you know, Plato was right in many respects, but there were certain very important things he was wrong about. And then various other thinkers would attempt to correct them. The medieval thinkers, the post-medieval thinkers like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, they all had something different to say. Then Kant came along with an explanation of why they were all wrong, and it was understandable that they would all be wrong about things like this. Oh, but then wait, not everybody agreed with Kant. In fact, soon people didn't. Very few people agreed with Kant. It seems impossible in philosophy in general, or in that part of philosophy called metaphysics, for philosophers to reach any consensus. It's like that in the sciences on the cutting edge, perhaps. But in the sciences, you find a large body of agreed upon fact and theory that's used without reflection. That is, say, scientists doing celestial mechanics will use Newton's theory without raising the question whether it's adequate. They all agree it's adequate to the task, at least in most cases. We don't find that in philosophy. Some disciplines like history are a sort of halfway house. There may be no body of agreed on theory that can be used in most cases, but at any rate, there's a large range of attested fact. In philosophy, we don't have any of that. It's no longer possible to believe that we do because of the undeniable fact of pervasive philosophical disagreement. And nowhere in philosophy is this more in evidence than in metaphysics.